I'm going to have the pleasure of welcoming the Honourable Julia Gillard for our In Conversation. So I could have printed off several sheets for this CV, but I've had to be brutal in paring it down so that we actually have the opportunity to hear you speak. Thank you. I think we'd better start with the obvious, which is that Julia was Prime Minister of Australia between 2010 and 2013. The first, and I think so far only, woman to hold that post.
Yes.
And in fact, the post of Deputy Prime Minister too. And that was the 3 years preceding that in the government of Kevin Rudd. So you're part of the Australian Labor Party. And when you were Deputy Prime Minister, I believe, now this shows the fantastic ability of women to multitask, you also landed roles as Minister for Education, Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations, and Minister for Social Inclusion. And I think all of those things ran pretty much in parallel, didn't they?
They did, all at the same time.
So I'm feeling pretty inspired already. Now, you were actually born in Wales, so you must be feeling fairly comfortable back in the UK. Although you migrated to Adelaide when just a child, I think 5 or 6 years old. And then in the 1980s, Julia went to the University of Adelaide and then Melbourne and managed to graduate with degrees, Bachelors of Law and also of Arts, and be president of the Australian Union of Students. She then joined the law firm, and I noticed that you made partner super fast, which is incredibly impressive. And then to the bit that is very special to us, which is Julia's involvement with education. You've been heavily involved in education since sort of retiring from politics. And here are just a few highlights. A visiting professor at the University of Adelaide, senior fellow at the Brookings Centre for Universal Education, chair of the Global Partnership for Education, I think that's in DC, in Washington, chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at KCL, chair of Beyond Blue, which is an organisation for mental health and well-being. That's something that's incredibly special to us here at Girton. Chair of the Wellcome Trust, and a raft of honorary degrees that's much too long to go through. It must be quite hard to decide which gown to wear for what, but we've given you a nice plain one this evening. I'm almost finished with these highlights, but I did think I should mention that among what you've authored is a book on women and leadership. And of course, as the first college for women in the UK, we're pretty interested in women in leadership. We were founded out of the suffragette movement. And I think that contains quite a lot of lessons learned, and we might be lucky enough to hear some of those this evening. While we do have Julia to tell us everything in person, it is worth saying that she does, of course, have my story, which is the autobiography. And I love the way it was split into two very hard-hitting parts. How I did it and why I did it. Clearly, there have been a great many achievements and challenges that you've had to overcome on the way. And I did warn Julia just before we came in that I'm going to mention that speech. And I think we should kick off with that. By that speech, it became known as the misogyny speech. And it's pretty much exactly 11 years to the week almost since you delivered that. I remember it at the time, and it was one of those spine-tingling speeches that you probably didn't even realise the impact it was going to have. But as you listened to it, it was a gasp moment, and it certainly has resonated. I think it's the kind of speech that history reflects increasingly well upon, and I thought, I'll just Google it. 6 million hits on YouTube as of today. So pretty amazing. It was devastatingly deliberate, and I think the kind of profound truth that just resonates across the world. So I was going to ask you, maybe you could just start with that. I know it was voted Australia's most unforgettable TV moment. Perhaps you could just reflect for us on how it felt at the time. Were your palms sweaty? Were you just outraged? And then how did it sink in afterwards?
Very happy to start with that. Thank you, and thank you for that very kind introduction. It's lovely to be here. We all look very grand, don't we? So terrific to be here. That speech in some ways was the work of a moment, and in some ways was the work of many years. And I always point out the many years bit because I've had lots of women say to me, I could never speak like that, I could never articulate an argument like that. And I'm always keen to say, well, I couldn't have done that either on my first day in Parliament. I mean, this is a learned skill. If you want to put yourself through the business of learning it, it's something that you can personally work up and get better and better at. And so by the time I gave that speech, I was a very seasoned parliamentarian. I'd served at the highest levels of opposition and of government. I'd been responsible for a number of years for the tactics of the opposition in the House. First woman to do that, and that is the position where you take all the hardest hitting debates and try and meld them around to your political purpose. So I was used to standing on my feet, taking a lot of incoming interjections, holding an argument in my head, writing it in my head even as I was delivering a speech, and these are all completely learnable, transferable skills. It was the speech of a moment in the sense that I didn't know I was going to be giving it until I walked into the Parliament that day. I had readied myself for question time. This is where I get critical of the UK Parliament. We sort of think that parliamentarians in the UK, ministers and prime ministers, really work part-time because you have this little curious thing of prime minister's question time and they only turn up periodically. Not in Australia. Our Parliament sits about 20 weeks a year, 4 days a week. Question time is an hour and a half each day. And unless you are in a hospital bed or away on a vital international meeting like going to the G20, there is no excuse for the Prime Minister missing question time. You go every day. And so you take most of the questions. And just to embellish how key it is that you're in question time is between 2 and 3:30 in the afternoon. I finished a question time on a Thursday, flew to Lisbon for a NATO ISAF meeting about the war in Afghanistan and was back in question time at 2 p.m. on Monday. And nobody in Australia thought that was an extraordinary thing to do because you shouldn't miss a question time. So this is serious. I thought I was going in for question time. I'd prepared. I knew from the media agenda that the theme of the day was going to be sexism. I'd asked my office to give me the Leader of the Opposition's most sexist top 10 quotes. I'd subsequently joked that of the research projects I'd ever set them, they didn't seem to find that a difficult one. They whipped that up very quickly. So I had those 10 quotes and I was going to use them in defence in question time, sort of throw them in. But the Leader of the Opposition decided tactically to forget about question time and to move straight to a debate in which he spoke first. And so the speech you see me give is the speech that I give in reply. So I only had the amount of time he was speaking for to write down some notes to kind of guide my thoughts as I gave the speech, and then I gave it. And I think the fact it's very immediate and in the moment shows. You know, if you'd said to me in a fortnight's time, give a speech on misogyny, I wouldn't have been able to give that speech. That speech is the work of a moment in that sense. And it's the channeling of a lot of frustration about how gendered my treatment had been as Prime Minister. But I didn't have any sense when I gave it that we'd still be talking about it 11 years later or that it would resonate outside the parliamentary chamber. I knew it was a very hard-hitting speech because you're very close to the opposition, so you can see how they're reacting. And I knew that it had landed powerfully in the parliament, but I didn't have any sense that it would go bigger. And in some ways, I think that's not so much about me as women's contemporary lived experience, where many women find themselves in circumstances where they know they are being treated lesser, than male counterparts. And when that happens, they sometimes can't find the words or don't have the power in the moment to raise it. And I think that speech has become an outlet for women when they hit those moments in their life, that they watch it and it helps with the frustration that we still live with. What I'd really like to see is that it becomes a bit of a museum artefact, because that is no longer the lived experience of women, but we're some generations away from that.
We sure are.
Yeah, we sure are.
Well, thank you. That's really reassuring to know that these are learnable and transferable skills, because certainly it's pretty daunting to see you fire off like that and try to imagine ourselves in that situation. I just have to reflect on this idea of 1.5 hours of intense questioning 4 days a week. That must be absolutely exhausting, wipe you out. Everyone expects you to be on your toes all the time.
Yeah, you get, it's hard, but you get better at it. One of the most interesting interviews I ever did, a man who is a professional footballer, or was a professional footballer in Australia and had a very, very long career, actually played, longer than most people are able to play. And he was doing this TV show about people who have become elite in all walks of life. So obviously a focus on elite sports people, but he interviewed me and he interviewed a number of others. And we actually had this very old sort of, sea dogs kind of discussion about when the adrenaline kicks in your body. And he'd say when he was a young footballer, the adrenaline would kick in his body several hours before the match, and he'd be bouncing off the walls in the change rooms, waiting to run out on the ground. And then as he got older as a footballer, he just got into a rhythm where it wasn't until he was walking up the race onto the ground that he could feel the kick of the adrenaline. So it was kicking at the last possible moment before he ran on for the match. And I got like that. It wasn't until I was walking through the glass corridor into the parliamentary chamber that I would feel the kick of the adrenaline. And so you were able to keep it in. You needed the kick. You definitely needed the kick. And there's an adrenaline letdown afterwards. But you were able to kind of manage the physiology of it so that it was exhausting you less and less the more you did it. It's a really weird thing.
Oh, sounds incredible. I mean, amazingly resilient. Of all the things that you've achieved, I was wondering, is there anything that you're just especially proud of that we might not think of? Sometimes that happens, where you can be really proud of something that doesn't hit the headlines. It doesn't have to be political.
Yeah,
really.
For me, the biggest moments in politics, obviously the celebrated moment is the misogyny speech, and then there are other ceremonial times that are quite celebrated. The photo of me getting sworn in as Prime Minister by Australia's first woman to serve as Governor-General is a very celebrated photo because of, it showing that times had changed for women in Australia. And I got to do things like address Congress in the US and things like that, and they're all really important moments. But for me, often the best moments were the ones where you'd been working on something for a long period of time. Public policy takes a lot of grind, and a lot of the grind isn't visible. And so you'd been working on something for a long period of time, and then you finally got it done. So the big moments for me were around the National Disability Insurance Scheme we created, some of the big changes we made in education, when we got an emissions trading scheme to try and reduce Australia's carbon emissions through the Parliament, big moments like that. And they're often not the ones that people remember in a political career.
No, that's right. Things that steal the headlines are quite often not the ones that you yourself feel personally proudest of. I do want to ask you, because we're Girton, a little bit about how you perceive education. Now, this is an incredibly broad question, but it's easy to take for granted it's also easy to dismiss education. Oh, that's expensive. It's a little bit elitist. It's much better to just go into the workplace. Why spend that time, that money getting educated? Why spend those resources when you could just go out and learn it? Do you have any thoughts on, especially for our students here, on why this is actually really important, apart from just your coursework?
I think the best way of emphasising the importance of education is to understand what happens when it's absent. I mean, it was burnt into my sister and I growing up as we did in a migrant home. I was born in Wales. My sister was born in Wales. We were both small when we went out to Australia. My parents are both Welsh, and for different reasons, neither of them finished secondary school. My father came from a coal mining village, lots of kids, not much money, and so he left school at 14 to go and work in the village shop, and then did a series of things, ultimately culminating when we migrated to Australia in training as a psychiatric nurse. So he did get a professional qualification later in his life, but he didn't finish school. My mother was very unwell as a child in a time where they didn't really have systems if you missed a lot of school to keep you up with the schoolwork. And so she just drifted away from school. And both of them were incredibly intelligent people, loved to read. My father loved to read about history. My father was very interested in politics. They wanted to debate ideas, discuss things, but their lifetime paths did not reflect. Whilst they both had good and long lives, it didn't reflect the intellectual potential and the intellectual curiosity that they had. And when I was chairing the Global Partnership for Education, which I've finished doing after 7 years, I mean, our mission globally was to make a difference to the fact that there are around about 260 million children in the world who will never go to school. Primary school, secondary school will never go to school. And whose lives will therefore be blighted by entrenched poverty and everything that comes with not even getting the most basic skills of literacy and numeracy, which are denied them. And when you think about it like that, for us to not understand how precious it is to have school systems in here and in my country which cater universally for children, and post-school systems which allow people to find their pathways, which may be vocational, but they may be very elite levels of education like the one you're engaged in here. I think it's just incredible that we don't understand the value of that. And if we look forward, I mean, nothing's getting simpler in the world. In many ways, any of the easy issues in the UK or Australia, simple things that should have been solved already have been solved. What's in the in trays of people who are trying to make a difference in the world now are all the really hard problems. And the really hard problems require creativity, intellectual labour, a more multidisciplinary approach than we've historically tended to bring to complex problems. And so the highest echelons of education, I think, can help build for us the teams we will need for the future to try and solve some of these very pressing issues.
Well, that's a compelling case. I suspect that you've had to learn the knack of how to sleep at night with lots of things to worry about. But what you've just said really makes me think it would be so fascinating to know what are your top 1 or 2 things in the world that would perhaps keep you awake at night? What's going on today that really troubles you?
Yeah, obviously the absence of peace in our world, Israel, Gaza, the Ukraine, all of that I think would be keeping many of us up at night. And the lack of genuine progress on climate change keeps me up too. One of the things I do now, as you would have heard, is I chair the board of the Wellcome Trust, which is a huge health and medical research fund headquartered in Euston Road here in the UK. It's the fortune, the endowment of Henry Wellcome, but now working globally on some of the most complex health challenges in the world. And one of the health challenges we're looking at is the intersection of climate change and health, and really we're field shaping to try and get scientists looking at this area. And I'm not a scientist, but even with my high school level of science, when I listen to the scientists talk, there's some very scary stuff out there about impacts for human health as the climate changes. And we just aren't seeing, the propulsive force we need in intergovernmental discussions to try and drive not only agreements. Actually, we're not that bad at coming to agreements like the Paris Agreement. What we're really bad at is delivering to them. That does mean that, potentially 1.5 degrees of average increased temperature may already be beyond our grasp, even though it was agreed in Paris. And we're heading for a series of climate discussions where inevitably the geopolitics of the world, which is so fragmented, is going to impact on how much progress can be achieved. So they're the two big things for me.
Yeah, probably two big things for me as well. This is probably quite difficult to distill, but imagine if you are 18, 19, 20 years old. What would be your biggest piece of advice to someone of that age group going into a career?
I would say be open to lots of change, and lots of change in your own understanding about what you want to do. When I look at my own, pathway, when I was in school, I liked school. I was one of those nerdy kids. I liked school, and so I liked my teachers. And I used to think, I'd like to be a teacher. And towards the end of my time in secondary school, and I just, sort of sidebar, aspiring to go to university and get a teaching qualification in my family was seen as big stakes, because my parents, as I explained, hadn't finished school themselves. So they weren't suggesting that wanting to be a teacher lacked ambition. They thought that was a great thing. But towards the end of my secondary schooling, a mother of friends of mine at school, twin girls I was very close to, said, you like debating, with one of the twins. I was in the debating club. You're interested in ideas, you should think about law. And over a sort of slow period at the end of school, that penny dropped, and I did go and study a mixture of law and English literature and economics at Adelaide University. And I could have said, well, that's my path. I'll get my law degree and that'll be the next, 20, 30, 40 years of my career. But what really took my attention when I got there was getting swept up in a campaign around education funding cutbacks, coming to understand more about public policy, about advocacy, ending up more and more senior in the student union movement until I was president of the student movement nationally. And that fundamentally changed my pathway and my perception. And I still did go into the law, but by then the sort of birth of ambition had happened, and I thought I would like to be in politics, and that was a journey to get there. But I decided that is what I'd wanted to do, and that's not something that ever would have occurred to me when I was 18. So I think just, in this world, which is so much more fast changing than the world I emerged into adulthood in, being really open to new possibilities as you navigate your way through your career is incredibly important. And getting clearer and clearer over time about your own sense of purpose, how you want to, what you want your life to be about, what you want its sort of, its golden thread to be about. That for me started off as education, access to education, quality of education, getting involved in these funding campaigns. And here I am, many, 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 many years later, and that's still part of the work that I do.
Fantastic. I think that's excellent advice. Amazing. Just before we finish, I wonder if you can just give a really quick snapshot of, we've talked a lot about the past. What's next for you? Where are you going?
Well, I don't need to kind of grab new things to do. I've got enough, and I'm very happy with the mix.
I bet you've said that before.
Yeah, I have said that before. There is I have a small office in Adelaide, Australia, and there is a joke in the office, which is, let's not let her have a Christmas New Year break, because if we do, she'll come back in January going, I've been thinking. I did that January, not this year, but last year. I said, it's going to be the 10-year anniversary of the misogyny speech. What about we put out a collection of essays on misogyny as a fundraiser for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership? Okay, let's go. And that was kind of a big thing to do in the time frame that we had to do it in. So I am trying to be more measured on all of that kind of stuff. So my current mix is I spend about half the year here in the UK, chairing the Wellcome Trust and chairing the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College, London. Back home in Australia, we now have a sister institute, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at the Australian National University, which is focusing on the Asia Pacific. And I chair Australia's major mental health charity, Beyond Blue, and I also chair 2 private sector boards, and that's kind of enough for me.
Yeah, we fully appreciate that, but we are incredibly honoured to receive you into our fellowship as an honorary fellow. It's an absolute pleasure. Your ethos, the points that you've raised, the things that trouble you, I feel like it's such a great fit for Girton College, and we're incredibly proud to have you among us. We have no expectations, don't worry. But I can see exactly how you must have had your audience rapt as you answered Prime Minister's questions for 1.5 hours pretty much every day.
No, they were quite busy yelling at me, so you've been much more polite.
Oh, well, that's good to know. So I think we're going to move on now to the next phase of the evening. But can we all please give Julia a massive round of applause?
Thank you. Thank you.